When Luke Skywalker met old Ben Kenobi in Mos Eisley, the Jedi Master had already spent 19 years in exile beneath the suns of Tatooine. He had buried his weapon, lost his connection to the Force, and spent every day watching Anakin's son from a distance. The galaxy believed Obi-Wan Kenobi had disappeared after Mustafar. It was wrong. Across 2 decades of canon, he survived 2 more duels with Vader, ended the last living enemy from his Padawan years, and fought a Wookiee bounty hunter sent by Jabba the Hutt. He protected Luke from raiders, rescued Princess Leia from the Inquisitorius, broke the Hutt's water tax campaign, sheltered an Imperial defector inside his own hut, and saved Luke a second time from a Tusken ambush in the days before A New Hope. The exile was active, repeated, and hidden afterward. It was the work that built the man Luke would eventually meet. The walk out of the Paulus Massa medical chamber was the longest of his life. Obi-Wan Kenobi carried a newborn in his arms and the body of the boy's mother on a hover gurney behind him. The child was the only thing left to Padme Amidala, and the Jedi Master had no idea what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. He was 38 years old. The Jedi Order was gone. The Republic had fallen, and somewhere beyond the lava shores of Mustafar, Anakin Skywalker was still alive. There was barely time to grieve before the surviving Jedi began deciding what happened next. Bail Organa would take the girl, Obi-Wan would take the boy, and Luke would go to Anakin's stepbrother, a moisture farmer named Owen Lars on Tatooine. Yoda gave him one final instruction before the ship left, and it had nothing to do with the boy. The spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn, struck down on Naboo 13 years earlier, had learned how to remain conscious within the Force after death, and Yoda wanted Obi-Wan to learn the same thing. Hours later, the ship landed on Tatooine. He arrived at the Lars homestead at sunset. Owen and Beru accepted the bundle without speaking, and Beru cradled the baby as the twin suns went down, while Obi-Wan stood at a distance and watched. He turned and walked into the waste alone. The hut he settled in sat in the Junlin Waste, a few hours' ride from the farm. He chose a new name because among the smugglers and farmers of Mos Eisley, no one would recognize the alias Ben. Then, he buried both lightsabers, his own and Anakin's. The blade of a Jedi was a beacon, and the men who hunted Jedi would know exactly what to look for. Both blades went into the sand outside his hut, where they would sit untouched for 10 years. The rule of exile was simple. He could watch the boy, but he could not act. He spoke to no one, used no force ability that could be sensed across light years, and waited. Owen guarded the farm by day, Beru guarded the house, and the hermit guarded the ridges above. 3 adults stood between Luke Skywalker and the galaxy, and only one of them carried a lightsaber buried in the sand. But the rules of exile, he discovered, were easier to set than they were to keep. The Gamorrean's axe was already mid-swing when the hooded man crested the ridge. 3-year-old Luke Skywalker stood in the dust of the Lars courtyard, threw a small toy starfighter as a distraction, and ran. The OP carrying the rider dropped its head and charged, and the blade came on a moment later, blue and humming. The first time it had been ignited in 3 years. The short story, Time of Death by Kevin Scott, captured the moment from inside Obi-Wan's head. He had felt the danger through the Force in his sleep, woken on the floor of the hut, and ridden out at full speed. By the time the blade came down on the last raider, Beru was holding Luke against her hip with a vibro axe at her feet, and Owen was standing in the courtyard with a fence post in his hands. The Lars family had been holding the line themselves before the hermit ever arrived. He had been ordered not to come, and he had come anyway. The Jedi Master had not used the Force in any meaningful way for almost 3 years. He had buried the lightsabers, taken what work the desert offered, and tried each night to reach Qui-Gon through meditation. But each night, the connection had stayed empty. The mandate Yoda had given was not arriving on the schedule he had imagined, so he filled the time with a journal. Marvel's Star Wars run by Jason Aaron, beginning in 2015, established the leather-bound book old Ben would write in across his exile. He recorded what he had done and wrote about the boy from a distance, but he did not write Anakin's name. That was the man Owen Lars walked up to in the courtyard after the raid. The punch caught him across the jaw before he could speak. Owen swung once, with everything he had, and the Jedi Master let the blow land. Owen told him that Luke had watched him fight, that the boy had seen the lightsaber, and would now ask questions for the rest of his life that the Lars family could not answer, and that Owen would not allow to be answered. The Jedi was not to come back, not to interfere again, no matter what the Force told him. Obi-Wan turned his Eopia around, and the blade went back into the sand. For most of the next 10 years, he kept the rule. He watched the boy from the ridges and filled pages with a life he was forbidden from joining, while the Force itself kept saying nothing. He had stopped fighting. stopped using the Force in any visible way, and stopped expecting an answer when he reached out into the night. He kept reaching anyway, because the work of exile was sitting with that emptiness until something on the other side decided he was ready. Then a stranger arrived at the hut from Alderaan. A girl had been taken, and the man who had been hiding for the better part of a decade had to leave Tatooine. The girl was no older than a young initiate. She had been hiding in a Jedi Temple training room when the clone troopers came in shooting, and she had watched her teacher cut down before she could run. The girl stepped into the corridor afterward, walked through the bodies of the children she had grown up with, and laid down among them. When the next patrol came through, they took her for one of the fallen, and she kept her eyes open the whole time. She had decided that day that she was going to find the man in the black mask who had given the order, and she was going to take her shot at him. That girl's name was Reva Savander. 10 years later in 9BBY, she would be the Inquisitor sent to flush out Obi-Wan Kenobi. The canon series Obi-Wan Kenobi premiered in May of 2022 and opened on that exact moment in the Coruscant Temple. Her place in the Inquisitorius, the order of Jedi hunters built from corrupted survivors of the Purge, was the next scene. She had infiltrated the program for one reason. She wanted Vader, and she wanted him alone. 10 years later, and back to Obi-Wan, the Jedi Master in the desert had not used the Force in any visible way since the Owen confrontation. The series found him in a sand whale meatpacking yard outside Anchorhead, carving slabs of meat for survival wages. A fugitive Jedi named Nari approached him on the streets, lightsaber in hand, asking for help, but Kenobi turned him away and told the younger man to throw the saber into the waste and run. The Inquisitors found Nari before sundown. That was the desert Bail Organa walked into a few days later. He brought a recorded message from Princess Leia, 10 years old, kidnapped from the Organa estate by mercenaries. Bail believed it was a trap to draw out a Jedi, and he believed only Kenobi could go after her, but Kenobi refused. He had a job watching Luke and could not leave Tatooine. The next morning, the hermit dug the lightsabers out of the sand. Across the long silence, Vader had believed Obi-Wan Kenobi was dead. Reva had pieced it together on her own and set the kidnapping in motion before her superiors knew. Her plan was to flush Kenobi out, deliver him alive, and use the credit to position herself close enough to Vader to take her shot. The trap was hers, not the Empire's. Daiyu was a smuggler's port half a galaxy from Tatooine, and the hermit went anyway. On the streets, he ran into a con artist named Haja Estri, a fixer who pretended to be a Jedi to extort money from desperate fugitives, and who unexpectedly helped him for free. Then the Inquisitors arrived, the Grand Inquisitor, the Fifth Brother, the Fourth Sister, and Reva. The Padawan demanded Kenobi alive, but Reva, watching her chance at Vader slip through her hands, turned her saber on her own commanding officer and chased the Jedi Master and the girl off the planet alone. The next stop was Mapuzo, and the path was already there. The path was the underground Jedi rescue network the rebellion had been quietly building, founded by Quinlan Vos, the Jedi Master who had survived Order 66. Kenobi found one of his old friend's inscriptions carved into the wall of a safe house, a line about how the eyes had to be closed before they could truly see, and he understood that he was not as alone in the waste as he had told himself. An Imperial defector named Tala Durith sheltered the two of them. Vader found him before they could leave. The first rematch was short and ugly. The hermit's connection to the Force was buried under 10 years of grief, and he could not reach it cleanly. But Vader could. He dragged Kenobi through a line of burning fuel and left him for dead in the dirt. Tala pulled him out, and the path's pilots got him to a hidden base on the storm-locked planet Jabim, where the leader of the network, Colin Roken, put him in a Bacta tank. He floated in the tank for a long time. He had told himself across the years of waiting that he had struck down his best friend, but his best friend had survived, was now wearing a black mask, and was hunting his daughter. He had lost. The man who had struck down Anakin Skywalker had just been beaten by him. And the worst part was, Anakin was still in there. Tala Durith pulled the pin on the thermal detonator and looked at Kenobi with the calm of someone who had already decided. The Imperial breach team was 20 meters down the Jabim corridor and closing. The blast doors behind her would not hold a second longer, and the refugees the path had been smuggling were already loading into the freighter on the launch pad. Tala held the live detonator at her hip, smiled at the Jedi Master once, and turned back into the hallway. Roken pulled Kenobi away from the door. The blast came a moment later, and the corridor was sealed. Tala was gone. The Loadmaster droid Ned B took a squad of stormtroopers and went down protecting the refugees as they boarded. Roken got his people off the planet, but he did not get them all off. Reva had reached Vader at last, and she had failed there too. The Inquisitor had not been climbing the ranks of the dark side acolytes for power, but towards one specific man. She found him alone at the Jabeam landing zone and went for the strike she had been preparing since the day she laid down among the bodies in the temple. Vader caught the blade, broke it, lifted her by the throat with the Force, and left her for dead on the ground. Reva, bleeding, intercepted a transmission and learned that the name on it was Luke Skywalker. The girl who had been kidnapped from Alderaan was not the only twin. Vader meant to take Luke himself, and the Inquisitor woke and made her own way to Tatooine ahead of him. The second rematch happened on a barren moon not far from Jabeam, and it was the rematch that mattered. Kenobi had taken the Path Freighter as a decoy and broken away alone in a smaller ship to draw Vader off the refugees. The two ships crashed down on a moon with no settlements and no witnesses. The Hermit started the fight the way he had started Mapuzo, half buried under the long silence, swinging defensively and retreating, until something in the rock shifted. He stopped retreating, reached fully and without apology into the Force he had been afraid to reach for since 19 BBY, and found it waiting for him. The duel turned. Kenobi struck through layers of armor and stone, drove him into the dirt, and brought the lightsaber down across the helmet of the man who had been Anakin Skywalker. The blade split the mask open, and the face inside was burned and pale, half flesh and half machine, with a voice that was Anakin's and Vader's at the same time. Anakin was gone, and what remained was something else. The Jedi Master told him he was sorry. He said it for all of it, for the Council, for Mustafar, for the years of believing he had done what he had not actually done. Then he turned and walked away. The man on the ground in the broken helmet was already finished. That was the moment Kenobi stopped being broken. Reva reached the Lars farm 20 hours later, and Luke was 10 years old. Owen and Beru saw her coming, and the response was instant. Beru pulled Luke into the kitchen, pushed him through a back run into the desert with directions to keep moving, then came back into the courtyard with a long barrel rifle in her hands. She held the front of the homestead while Owen took the side, unarmed except for a wrench. Farm had a defense plan, and the two of them had drilled it. Beru fired on Reva before the Inquisitor cleared the gate, but Reva pushed past her. Luke made it some distance into the waist before he tripped and went down, and Reva caught him in a shallow rise of stone. She raised the saber, but she did not bring it down. She saw the bodies in the temple, the man in the black mask who had given the order, and what she would become if she finished the strike. She understood that she had spent 10 years trying to put a saber through Vader and was now, in the only mirror that mattered, about to become him. Reva lowered the blade, picked the boy up, walked him back to his uncle's farm, and put him in his aunt's arms. She stood in the courtyard with her own weapon at her feet and asked the Jedi Master who had just arrived if she had become what she had hated. He told her she had not. That night, Kenobi rode out into the dunes to think. He sat on a ridge under the twin moons, felt something he had been waiting since Polis Massa to feel, and turned. Qui-Gon Jinn was standing in the sand behind him, fully visible, smiling. His master told him he had been there the whole time, and the student had not been ready to see. The mandate Yoda had given him on Polis Massa had finally arrived. The day Kenobi let go of the man who had not actually been his to save. He thought the worst of it was behind him, but he had years of work ahead. Within a year of the duel, the planet itself started running out of water. 10 feet from the kitchen door, Owen Lars stood with his hands open and empty, watching a Wookiee enforcer kick over a moisture vaporator and let the precious water spill into the sand. Beru kept a rifle behind the door, but did not draw it. The enforcer was there to collect a tax, and the tax was water. On the ridge above the homestead, a hooded man on an Eope watched the whole thing without moving. That was the opening of Star Wars Issue 7 by Jason Aaron, illustrated by Simone Bianchi. Tatooine had been suffering a years-long drought, and Jabba the Hutt had decided the desperation was an opportunity. Pay the Hutts, or the Hutts would take it from your tanks. Owen had been paying, and half the farmers on the rim had been paying, but the other half had been buried. He had told himself across the long silence that he was just Ben, and the day the water tax came was the day that lie ran out. He did not ride back to the hut. He found a Jawa fixer named Tika, traded for a load of black melons, and arranged for the Jawas to deliver them to the Lars farm before dawn. The trade was charity disguised as commerce, run through a middleman so Owen could not trace it back to him. Then a young Luke went and made the situation worse. The boys stole back the water the Hutts had taken, and he was around 10 years old. Luke trailed the enforcers, found the cash, and tried to siphon some of it back. He was caught and struck, and by the time the hermit reached him, the child was unconscious in the sand. The Jedi Master carried him home and watched from the ridge as Beru came out with her rifle already drawn, scanned the dunes for the men who had hurt him, and brought him inside. The next time the Hutts sent a collection party, the hermit was waiting for them in the desert, and he took them apart with the Force and the lightsaber in the open for the first time on Tatooine. A year passed, and Luke wrecked the family T-16 Skyhopper across the canyon floor on his first solo flight. Issue 15 by Aaron and Mike Mayhew picked up the journal. Owen grounded him and refused to spend the credits on replacement parts. So the Hermit went back to Tika, traded for the parts, and had the Jawas deliver them anonymously. Owen returned every component to the Sandcrawler the next morning. The Hutts had not forgotten, and a year later, Jabba sent Black Chrysanthemum. Chrysanthemum, a Wookiee bounty hunter and former gladiator, had come for the man who had quietly broken Jabba's collection campaign. Issue 20 by Aaron and Mayhew established the contact. The hunter grabbed Owen Lars off the homestead as bait. Beru got the rifle up and fired on him before he was past her, hit him in the shoulder, and was knocked unconscious for it. Luke, around 12 years old, scrambled into the Skyhopper and flew after them. The fight nearly ended the exile. The Hermit caught up to them in the dunes and engaged Chrysanthemum with the lightsaber lit. The Wookiee was stronger than he remembered, and the Hermit was rustier than he had ever admitted. Chrysanthemum got his hands around his throat and lifted him off the ground, and fighting for breath, Kenobi reached into the Force, brought a wall of falling rock down to save Owen, and scarred Chrysanthemum across the eye with the lightsaber. The Wookiee dropped him, and the hunter would carry that scar for the rest of his career. Luke arrived in the Skyhopper a moment later and pulled Owen off the dune at full throttle. In the silence after the fight, Owen and the Hermit looked at each other across the sand. Neither thanked the other, but both men understood, for the first time, that they were on the same side. Beru, back at the homestead, woke up with a concussion and went back to drilling Luke on how to break for cover. He had told Owen Lars that he would protect the boy from a distance, and he had stopped pretending that was possible. The Shadow campaign against the Hutts was not the work of a retired Jedi waiting to die in the sand. It was the work of a Jedi who had quietly returned to service. 7 years passed in silence. The hooded figure crossing the Tatooine dunes alone into BBY was not Obi-Wan Kenobi. He was a Zabrak with horns filed to points, a half-cybernetic body, and a Sith holocron fragment in his belt that had once been part of the great ancient temple on Malachor. He had been hunting the Jedi Master who had cut him in half above the reactor pit on Naboo for 30 years and counting. The galaxy still called him Maul. The episode Twin Suns, from the canon series Star Wars Rebels, written by Dave Filoni and Henry Gilroy, opened on that walk. Maul had used the holocron fragment to triangulate Kenobi's hiding place, and rather than search the waste himself, he had reached out through the dark side to a Force-sensitive young rebel named Ezra Bridger. Maul used the boy's curiosity as bait and let him lead the way to Tatooine. An ancient enemy crossed the galaxy looking for him, and he fell in 3 strikes. Ezra wandered the waste calling for Kenobi, while the horned figure closed the distance behind him. The Hermit found Ezra first, took the boy off the open desert, and told him that the rebellion already had what it needed. Ezra was to go home and finish what he had started with his own teacher. Ezra went home. Maul stepped out of the dark on the other side of the fire a moment later. The two men recognized each other across the flames. The horned figure asked, almost gently, what the older man was doing on this rock, and the Hermit answered that he was protecting something. Maul understood, in that moment, that whatever the Jedi was guarding was the Chosen One, and he ignited the double-bladed saber. The Hermit drew his own and dropped into the stance Qui-Gon Jinn had taught him on Naboo decades earlier. Maul's last word was a prophecy, and Kenobi let him have it. The duel lasted 3 strikes. Maul opened with the same hilt strike to the face that had killed Qui-Gon, and Kenobi had spent 30 years studying that move. He shifted his blade into the path of the first strike, deflected the second, and brought the third down through Maul in a single clean motion. Maul fell sideways into the sand, and the Hermit caught him before he hit the ground. The two men who had circled each other for 30 years sat in the sand together as the night came on. Maul, breathing in shallow pulls, asked whether the man Kenobi was protecting was the Chosen One, and the Hermit said he was. The horned figure closed his eyes and told the older man with something close to relief that the Chosen One would avenge them, and then he was gone. The Jedi Master sat with the body for a moment, lowered Maul's eyes, and stood up. The man who had killed Qui-Gon was buried in the sand of the same planet that had once been Anakin Skywalker's home. By the time the suns came up, the Hermit was already on the ridge above the Lars farm. The closing shot of the episode was old Ben, hood up, standing on a low-rise as the twin suns cleared the horizon, and a young Luke came out of the moisture farm dome to start his day's chores. He did not look up, and he did not know that the man on the ridge had just ended his oldest enemy on his behalf the night before. He was 55 years old, and he had 2 more years of quiet left. The sandstorm had been blowing for 2 days. Inside the hut, an Imperial helmet sat on the low table beside a candle, its left lens cracked and dim. A stormtrooper named JM909, whom the hermit had nicknamed Jim, sat across from old Ben in the corner trying to decide what to do with the rest of his life. The Jedi Master had pulled him out of a Tusken ambush in the wastes that morning, brought him back to the hut, and offered him neither a lecture nor an arrest. That was the framing scene of Star Wars Obi-Wan, the 5-issue canon comic by Christopher Cantwell. The miniseries opened in 1 BBY, with the hermit writing in a leather-bound journal during a sandstorm. JM909 was a conscript who had followed his orders into the desert and woken up in a stranger's hut. The choice the hut offered him was the same one it would offer Luke roughly a year later. He could finish his orders, or he could walk out into the desert as a different man. He walked out into the desert. By the last year of exile, his hair had gone white, and his master finally answered. The short story Master and Apprentice by Claudia Gray depicted the moment in the days just before A New Hope. The hermit was riding on his Eopie across the dunes when he came across the smoking wreck of a Jawa sandcrawler, and every Jawa on board lost. He recognized the discipline of the blaster fire, sat down in the sand beside the wreck, and Qui-Gon Jinn appeared next to him, nearly corporeal, smiling. The Jedi who had begged Qui-Gon for an answer in the silence of 18 BBY was now sitting beside him on the dunes, having a quiet conversation about what came next. The mandate Yoda had given on Polis Massa was complete, and the student had become what the master had been. Qui-Gon told him the boy had a great journey ahead, and then he was gone. The Tusken war cry came at the bottom of a sandpit 2 miles from his hut. The chieftain of the local tribe, a one-eyed warrior named Iark, had ordered the strike on the 2 figures crossing the dunes. One was a young human male in a landspeeder, the other a tall protocol droid. 3 Tuskens broke from cover and brought the boy down in a shallow pit before he could reach a weapon. The hermit arrived a few minutes later. He cupped his hands to his mouth and produced a long, low call from the back of his throat. The Tuskens froze because they knew the call and had grown up under it. The cry of the Krayt Dragon was the one sound on Tatooine that emptied a hunting party in seconds. The chieftain pulled the tribe back over the ridge and did not look behind. The hermit walked into the pit, helped the boy to his feet, and listened to a story about a missing astromech and a recorded message from a princess. The boy was 19 years old, and his name was Luke Skywalker. He had been preparing for one specific morning across the entire exile, and it came with a Tusken war cry and a boy in a landspeeder. The man who had carried infant Luke off Polis Massa was now standing in a sandpit looking at the same boy nearly 2 decades later. The hermit told Luke his name was Ben. Obi-Wan did not spend those years waiting. He spent them learning when to stay hidden, when to act, and how to become useful after death. The lightsaber he handed Luke in the cantina had been buried in the sand for the better part of the exile. The "from a certain point of view" speech he delivered in Return of the Jedi was a line he had rehearsed alone on the dunes during the years his master was not yet answering. The smile old Ben gave Vader on the Death Star in the moment before he raised his blade and let the strike land was the smile of a man who had been getting ready to vanish across the entire silence and finally got to do it. He had not spent his exile watching Luke, he had spent it learning how to come back from the dead so he could keep watching Luke after he was gone. By the time Luke found him in the desert, Ben Kenobi was not simply the last Jedi hiding on Tatooine. He was the survivor those years had built. If you want the channel to keep digging into the corners of canon and legends that other channels skip, join the channel membership. Members get the long-form deep dives early, vote on which subjects we research next, and get access to extended cuts that do not make it into the public version.